Welcome everyone to this special edition of the Aptrinsic webinar series. For those new to the series, we cover all topics related to product management and product growth. Today we're going to be discussing the partnership between product and customer success, along with some of the best practices on how to bring these two teams together to drive growth. My name is Travis Kaufman, VP of Product Growth here at Aptrinsic, and I'll be your host. Now for today's format, we're bringing two different views to the discussion, the product view and the customer success view. I feel very honored to be joined by our two guests from Gainsight, Ganesh Subramanian and Minh Phan. Ganesh has actually a very interesting background. He joined Gainsight 3 years ago and built out the enterprise CSM team, as well as built out the advisory services practice. He's now a leader on Gainsight's product marketing team, where he uses those customer insights and shapes both Gainsight as well as the customer success industry. So very happy to have Ganesh with us today. In his role as a CS leader, he delivered on some really impressive renewal and retention metrics, retention rates. And for today's discussion, we've asked him to share his perspective on customer success. So he's our representative for the customer success side. We also have Minh Phan, who will be representing the product management perspective. So Minh has held product roles at companies like Symantec, Seagate Cloud, and is currently Senior Director of Product Management here at Gainsight. He's had responsibilities for product vision, go-to-market strategy, and also customer experience. So again, a great collection of minds to discuss this topic with us today. So very happy to have him here.
Thank you so much for having us.
You bet, you bet. So before we get into the format, just a quick couple of housekeeping items. We will record this session, and I'll make sure to send this out to everyone, so you don't need to take copious notes, although you're welcome to. And if you have questions, we will hold some time at the end. And you're welcome to either ask within the webinar provider here in the Q&A section, or post out on a Twitter, and I'll go ahead and monitor both of those at the end of the session. So if you have questions, jot them down, and we'll get to you at the end. All right, so without further ado, what I'd like to start with is really just a general discussion around how should product and success teams work with one another. So for this one, I'll go ahead and start off with Minh here, just to get his perspective.
Yeah, sure. So, customer success teams typically come with the lens of customer health. And from a product perspective, we are looking at things from a product perspective. And so the customer health actually rolls up into product health for us. And so we do all of this tracking, and then we are looking at things at a product level to understand what's driving the health of the product. And obviously, it's like, we need to then, from a product perspective, think about how do we drive success at scale as opposed to on an individual customer by customer perspective. And so what we are then looking at is things like defects and enhancement requests that success teams have identified as adoption barriers. We're looking at in-product communication that could help improve adoption as well to enable the customer success team to work more efficiently. And then we also do a number of product councils to enable us to gather feedback both directly from customers, but also from the CS teams themselves, because they do cover quite a bit of customer conversations across the company. And so they play a hugely influential role in the internal product councils that we have.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. And just to add to that, I love the specific areas of overlap, everything from product councils to individual customer by customer success scenarios, things like enhancement requests, things like that, escalations that need product involvement. Putting that into a broader context, when I think about the success perspective, ultimately product and customer success, they're shooting for the same objective, which is ultimately to make value for our customers. And that value, Minh actually shared with me a really cool equation. And Minh, I hope you don't mind me sharing it with the group here, which is, if you think about value, it's the benefits that you deliver for a given customer over those associated costs. And those costs aren't necessarily just what they pay you, but they can be things like administrative burden or the effort or the time to value, or even opportunity costs. What else could those customers be doing with those resources? And so with that kind of value in mind as that shared objective, there's a lot of different ways that product and success should work together. From the success perspective, we're thinking a lot about customer segmentation. How can we deliver the right journey for the right type of customer given those resources available to them and to your business. So if you've got a high touch strategic account, okay, maybe you can afford to give them a more high touch customer journey. And maybe you can have on-site teams, maybe even have a CSM on-site there once a week, if not more, versus your at scale accounts. You need to really start thinking about automation and leveraging a lot of one-to-many communications. As you think about high touch all the way down to tech touch, you're not going to be successful if the product doesn't ultimately deliver that value for that customer. So in many ways, there's a lot of overlaps between product and success and delivering that value. And there's got to be a constant communication back and forth. Where can people be taken out of the equation and be replaced with a feature functionality enhancement, where maybe you can add more scale to your motion?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how you both describe it. So the perspective from the product is that I've created something with the intent of serving a specific customer. And then you take the customer success side of the house and says, I have these customers, they have these needs. Let me kind of focus my energy around making them successful. So I think the unit is actually quite fascinating, but the combined two, I think becomes really powerful. So one of the next questions that we'll ask and we'll talk about is really shared goals. And with the topic of what each team cares about in mind, I mean, what would you say are the overlapping goals that two teams share? Ganesh?
Yeah, and I'll kick off kind of along the same line of thinking, taking that value equation to the next level. How do you actually unpack that? And again, ultimately, your business is most likely thinking about driving growth, right? So how are you landing new business? How are you expanding that business, driving advocacy? And underneath all of that is value. So if you're not delivering value for your customers, it's really hard to drive growth for your business. So at the highest level, having alignment across the business, saying that every function ultimately is in service of this higher goal, is a really important thing that I've found in working with customers, especially as you go through this change management effort from going from a world where you used to ship product and then implement it, and then who knows, maybe sell them again in a couple of years.
Yeah.
As you kind of go through this transformation, seeing that these shared goals require a lot more collaboration, that's where things get really interesting. So let's unpack that high level goal of value. So ultimately, it's hard to be effective if you don't have kind of sub pillars or sub goals that each team is accountable for. So one thing that we think a lot about when we advise our clients is, if you have that shared charter of value, land, adopt, expand, renew, whatever the model is you're going for, what is the portion of the life cycle that success is specifically trying to own and optimize? And what are those points of collaboration with product? So oftentimes a success team is coming in right at the cusp of a sale. So maybe they'll be involved a couple weeks before that end of quarter push, and they'll get involved with their customers, understand what those challenges are. They'll work with them through onboarding and then long-term into that adoption success motion. You can see points of overlap with product, and some of them might be on an ad hoc escalation basis, and others might be more programmatic in ways that you want product involved throughout so that you can get them informed, but also leveraging those customer insights and at the same time providing a lot of feedback. So if you think about those ad hoc events, you might find right before that deal closes, right at the beginning of that customer journey, oh, wow, the customer's aligned to something that our product is, maybe it's an edge case, or maybe not even something that's really shipped yet for GA. Well, wow, maybe that's something we need to get product in pretty early and involved through that onboarding cycle. Maybe through that onboarding cycle, we also have these moments where the implementation is going awry. Maybe they expected certain things that the product isn't quite able to deliver in the common way that services would typically implement something. You need an expert from product to kind of come in. So you need a mechanism to effectively highlight that and collaborate to bring product in. But now there's also those standard engagements too, right? You've got, Minh mentioned a few of those critical cadences. So one being the advisory boards. So getting the customer success team to bring the right group of people to the table to provide feedback back to product so that we know what few investments will raise the value for the customers en masse. And there's many more examples of those common, regular occurring ones as well.
Yeah, totally. You know, and frankly, like if you're not expanding, you're not growing the account, then, you know, that by definition means you're stagnating. But it actually also means that you're really dying. You're losing the account in my mind. And so we always need to be in a position of pushing for expansion and not just letting an account go stagnant. That sort of momentum is very, very important to maintaining and growing the business. And so, yeah, as a part of that, right, part of that is driving the actual adoption, right? What customers already have, getting the users to go into the product and getting value out of the product on a consistent basis. But then the other part of that is to actually also continue to add value. So, you know, like always thinking about what is that value curve that your customers should be on, and keeping them on that curve so that they're always thinking about, you know, new capabilities that then add value to their business. And I take, you know, from a product perspective, I take a kind of a jobs-driven approach to how we think about product innovation, in that we have to understand, you know, what is the role that this person is taking on? What are all the activities that they do on a day-to-day basis in their job? And what, you know, where does our product play into that day-to-day role? You know, customers are not buying our solution; they're hiring us. So we have to think about, you know, ourselves, Gainsight, you know, whatever tool you have to think about that tool as being a function of hiring. They're hiring you, and so, you know, so they're hiring you not just for the capabilities that you have today, but they're hiring you for your ability to grow and develop over time as a, you know, this virtual technology employee, right? And so you need to continue to grow and expand your value, and continue to also like fit the need of the customer as well. Like, you know, customer needs are constantly changing. Now, I think one thing that, you know, it's kind of obvious that we often talk about like driving end user adoption. But I'll point out what I've learned over time is that's not obvious is actually also taking care of those who have to manage your product. And it's often kind of an oversight, or maybe it doesn't feel as important because it's not, you know, upfront with the user, and maybe it doesn't affect, you know, the same number of people. But the fact of the matter is that those who are managing your product, the admins or the IT folks, are hugely critical in terms of ensuring that whatever that's been deployed could be managed at, you know, and scalable over time. And so oftentimes what happens is there's a cost to adding users or to adding new teams. There's a cost to adoption of new features. And if you don't get that cost equation down and you're driving a ton of costs on the administrative and IT side, then you're going to get a lot of pushback from the company towards the adoption of your product.
It's interesting. And so you mentioned external stakeholders in addition to the users of your product. I mean, do you find that many product teams today are maybe focused too much on the user persona, leaving the customer success team to manage really every other persona that may not be in the product but impacted by the solution?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, like in some ways, like the customer success folks are going in and kind of like helping with the gaps.
Yeah.
But then I think there are product gaps, but I think like that's probably a lower value kind of thing that customer success teams could do. The larger value piece, I think, is the conversation about driving larger expansions. So for example, if you've landed a certain account, you know, we've landed many, many enterprise accounts, for example. But our footprint in these enterprise accounts currently are actually very small. And it's typical of the case because like, you know, like these enterprise accounts are huge, right? They could have tens of thousands of end users, and you know, lots and lots of business units. And so the really high value, I think, place where customer success teams can engage in is, first of all, enabling like where you've landed successful. So maybe that first business unit, but then really figuring out how to then drive expansion so that other business units within the company are also thinking about your solution. Or like, let's say it's a small account, the customers thinking about new ways to use your product so that you can then expand and broaden kind of the footprint that you've got in that environment.
Excellent.
You know, one of the things, Minh, you mentioned as well is kind of one of the product-specific goals is identifying where to invest in the product to grow the business, whether into new verticals or to expand the current organic install base, right? So how to prioritize and figure that out.
Yeah.
And one thing I'm just curious from your perspective, since that is one of the main goals of product, but not necessarily something that success teams are thinking about on a day-to-day, but a lot of the insights from the CS team can go inform that. I'm curious from your perspective on what data points or what collaboration would you love to see from success teams in providing that insight to help you make better informed decisions about roadmap?
Yeah, you know, if the pain is all about how do I enable the customer to expand, right? And I think we often get feature requests that are considered blockers. But the hard part is to really figure out how to really feel what it means to have a blocker. You know, like tell us the story in which this blocker is impacting someone. You know, like, is it causing them embarrassment, you know, because maybe the data is wrong or often inaccurate because of how we're doing certain things? Is it, you know, causing them to stay up late on a Friday night to, you know, like do this or that so that things could be ready on a Monday morning? You know, like to give us a sense for that visceral pain really helps me from a product management perspective to go out there and influence the rest of the team. I think a lot of people do not understand that, you know, they think that the product management role is one where we get to dictate what needs to be done. You know, we're like some sort of god or something where we're okay, guys, these are the priorities, you know, get it done.
The CEO of the product, right?
Yeah,
it's a misconception.
Exactly. It's a huge misconception. You know, like engineering does not report to me, right? And so, you know, my role here is to influence, and to influence, you know, we have a lot of competing priorities, and so to influence, I need to help the team understand how to prioritize. And so part of that comes from a kind of being able to quantify the priorities, you know, like being able to quantify the impact, you know, like by saying, okay, this is how many customers it impacts. This is how much time it's costing our users. And so part of it is trying to quantify things, right? But then the other part is having the stories to tell so that our engineering team, like, you know, can really empathize and have kind of this visceral feeling of like, oh, I get it. I now know why this is so painful. And sort of driving that sort of emotional story so that our development team can really feel it. Enables them to not only build better products, but then they work on it with much greater kind of appreciation of the problem they're solving, and you know, and they'll get it done. I think much more aggressively. When they have those stories in place.
I love that, and I was just going to add to that. You know, I love the way you said emotional story. One thing I used to coach my team on was getting the emotional narrative, which is what Minh said, the emotional story, the emotional narrative, into their notes. And back to Minh, your point about you need to be able to influence without authority. Part of it is the data, part of it is the emotional side of it. Being able to get both at scale is really tough, especially when you start saying we need, it's often the story that convinces people or motivates people. But how do you get emotional stories at scale to your team? Not to make the product plug, but the customer 360 is kind of the central place where we do that. And we found that with the timeline, being able to capture those notes, the good, the bad, the ugly, in that central dashboard, and then being able to report on that can help teams collaborate to identify, oh, wow, okay, we are now able to cross-tab, for instance, let's say our highest adopted users with some of the narratives behind what got them there. Well, let's look at the flip side. Let's look at some of our least healthy customers, maybe poorest adoption, least ROI. From a quantitative perspective, now let's map the narrative behind it. all in one view.
It's interesting. The way I hear you both describe it, I mean, that is a shared goal. Understanding,
Totally.
going beyond the ask, what the customer is asking for, feature-wise, or whatever it be considered a blocker or not, going beyond that, understanding the narrative sounds like another common goal that both teams share.
Yeah, absolutely. Oftentimes it's getting to that underlying understanding of value and then parsing through the noise in order to enable them to get there.
Yeah.
One thing, Minh said earlier, product managers aren't gods, and CS teams can't deliver value unto themselves for customers. It's always a shared effort, and the best job a CSM can ever do is be that motivational trainer or coach who gets the client to start exercising and using the product and learning about the product and deploying it in a way that's effective for their team.
Right. I mean, you two, I think, are a great example of when product success teams are working well together. I mean, I think many customers that are in similar situations, I think there's maybe some tension that exists between the two departments.
Right.
Now, how would you express the ways that you either went about or you would recommend aligning product and success around these common goals?
Yeah. Well, let me start with what you definitely should not do.
Oh, good.
Because that's always fun. To see, sometimes it's easier to know not to do that than, this is a really thing, high visibility strategic thing I should do. Here's what I've seen fail. Customer success says, we need to understand how our customers are using the product. And as product, hey, can you give us usage data? And then product says, okay, we don't really have a lot of time. No one does. So here's a download of a bunch of usage data. Here you go do stuff. That has been a recipe for failure time in, time out. So let's unpack that. What was the issue? Neither team had a common understanding of what the objective was. What were they trying to solve? Neither team had a hypothesis or shared that hypothesis with each other for what would really move the needle for customers. And as a result, it was, I need this, and then someone tosses something back over the fence, and that ends up making both parties quite angry at each other. Success teams say, product, you don't get customers. You don't get what we need. You don't get what it takes to make a customer successful. And product says, you're wasting our time with all these meaningless requests. If I allocated that time towards enhancing the product, you would be much better off anyway. So I'm just not going to listen to you anymore. So what's the flip side of that? One thing that I've seen work really well, and I'll highlight Cisco in this example. Think about the number of products and the number of portfolios that they operate under. What we've seen them do is have a programmatic approach to understand first what drives value for customers, and then back into what is the data we need in order to drive that process. And so it doesn't matter whether it's their collaboration business unit, if it's in the cloud, or whether it's an on-premise network or router, network switch or router. They have the same set of KPIs and processes that they follow at the 10,000 foot level, and then they back into the right metrics and usage data on a product by product basis. So they align to the same high-level vision, and then they work collaboratively across product and success teams to then say, we need metrics that align to these high-level metrics of value. So a simplified version of that is one thing we do at Gainsight for most of our SaaS businesses in the SMB space is our DEAR framework. So we think about this as a pretty common understanding of what success could look like. So DEAR stands for what is your current deployment of your product. So if you're a license-based model, what percentage of your licenses have been assigned? Engagement, so how are people at your customers engaging with you? Adoption, so of the people that have licenses, what is their breadth and depth of adoption? And R stands for ROI. So if you can have metrics that align to those 4 variables, you can now have a framework to work with product to get really specific and say, if you can get me at least V1 of some of this rough and tumble data, I can start taking action on that. So that's kind of one way that I've been trying to think about this as a collaborative effort.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the data. So it's something that at Aptrinsic we've thought a great deal about, and you're absolutely right. There's this, for any SaaS product, this web traffic and page views, and it becomes just nonsense, right? What what we've found is that when there's a discussion between the two teams around what are the features that one exist and we can track, and what are the features that matter, and then providing that information to success, I think it causes the conversation to occur around what are the things that matter. And sometimes deeper analysis is necessary, right? I mean, saying that a customer uses every single feature doesn't necessarily translate to understanding what are the ones that really matter versus the ones that we continually have to invest in on the product side.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah,
totally. You know, I think the mistake I often see is, or the challenge I often see is that, you know, a customer success person has ownership over their sets of customers. And so, you know, like they're representing the needs of their customers. And so they're representing the needs of their customers in a way that, you know, is of course like absolutely important to them. And so like the requests that are coming in are truly important, and it's like the most important thing. And there might be kind of a lack of awareness that we actually need to look across the success organization, and we need to figure out how to prioritize those things would have the greatest impact across the organization. And so, you know, and so in addition to getting kind of the ongoing feedback, having these sort of product council meetings where we pull the CS team together so that they can help us prioritize is actually where I think we get the greatest value. And then on the product management side, the mistake that I often see product managers make is that product managers often come into these things with the mindset of prioritization because they know they only have a certain number of engineers to work with. So how do you prioritize what's most meaningful? And so you end up with product managers who often are pulled into customer conversations, who are coming in with the mindset of, how do I, you know, think about the importance of what the customer is saying to me? You know, is it lower in value, higher in impact, or what, right? And so sometimes the conversation could feel kind of like you aren't really taking the customer seriously enough, because, you know, even if this is a situation that impacts one customer, it is the most important thing that this customer is dealing with, and there's real pain behind it, right? And so the job at that moment is not to think about prioritization. The job at that moment is actually to empathize and to think about what the customer pain is, and to actually think about how you as a product manager can go back and be a champion for that customer into your group. And so that way it helps you to really think not only in a way of like supporting the customer, but then also to think about in a way of like, how can I make the best business case on behalf of this customer? And it might not end up being, you know, a sufficiently strong business case, but then it allows you to really like make an effort, a true effort into making sure that you are representing the customer's voice and enabling the team to empathize with the situation. And then we can prioritize accordingly, but don't put the prioritization process in front and make the customer feel like they're not valued or their issue is not as important for whatever reason.
Right.
I like that approach a lot, Minh, and also thinking about the creativity that can come from being empathetic, rather than blocking off the input and immediately going into the framework you had going into the meeting. Rather setting that aside. And I love that the way you said the job of the moment is to be empathetic and to listen. And oftentimes, I mean, you can probably speak to this better than I can, but you often have a solution that isn't what the customer recommended, but it was actually maybe something that was high on your priority list, but there is maybe a slight tweak or an adaptation to that might solve this client's use case. And so that's kind of the secret sauce of success product collaboration that I saw in my time leading the success team was, how do you get back to the client once they've asked for an enhancement request, or once they've identified an area where they want some feature functionality,
right?
Because it's a many-to-many map, and oftentimes the update happens in another aspect of your platform or application, and that separate update, maybe by a separate team, could have downstream effects to solve this client's use case. So there's a lot of different moving pieces, and I think the key to that is listening, capturing the right data points, being really empathetic, and constantly putting the customer first to be able to think creatively about their problem from their vantage point.
Excellent. So you both mentioned earlier related to what are the metrics in both having, the understanding of, what is the information that you need to either evangelize or to advocate on behalf of the customer. It leads, really into the next question that we have is, how is each team measured? So what are the KPIs for customer success? What are the KPIs for product management? And how do those two relate to one another? I don't know if Ganesh, you want to start off with this one.
Yeah, so if you think about the classic success team in a recurring revenue business, the end goal is ultimately retention or gross retention, right? Now then there's subsequent measures of net retention or organic growth. So when you make a client successful, they're prime and they're ready for expansion. And ultimately you want them to be advocates for you, where they're out preaching in the marketplace on LinkedIn and other social networks of how awesome it is that they work with you, right?
Yeah.
So with gross retention, the number one goal, you have to think about adoption and value delivery as the leading indicators of that. And there's a lot of work that I think happens exclusively to the CS organization. And I use the word CS to include all of services, training, enablement, support, success, all of the services wrapped up into making that client successful and using your product. So there's a lot that goes on there. The part that I think overlaps the most with product is those areas of where a couple changes could have impact across your portfolio of customers. And I think that's really where the point of collaboration needs to be fine-tuned in the market.
Yeah.
I think right now, if I think about a lot of the teams that I've worked with, the CSM is a champion when they go above and beyond to solve something in maybe a unique one-off case. But the implication of that is that if that's happening time and time again, you're running an extremely inefficient model. So the champion should do that every single time when needed, but to be really celebrated, should go above and beyond and identify those trends and share that with products so that they don't have to go above and beyond every single time.
Right.
Ideally, if there was a world where a product would sell, implement, and deliver success completely independently of a team, wow, that would be kind of the end game. And that's probably the vision where no CS team wants to put themselves out of a job, but that should be the vision of the CS organization.
Yeah, and I think in what you mentioned there, I think absolutely measuring adoption, the breadth and depth, and value metrics are super, super key. I think the one other thing that we think about is around the customer effort as well. So so the adoption metrics really help you figure out what kind of work you need to do to get the customer to really get the greatest value out of your solution. And it really helps to then understand what steps in this adoption process are they having trouble with, and if there's one key item that they should be adopting that are great indicators of their retention, them coming back over and over again to the product, then those metrics will help you figure out, what can you do to drive the customer to do that one thing that is associated with customer retention. But I also like to think about the customer effort because, with every sort of activity that the end user is doing in the product, with every sort of activity that the administrator is doing in the product, there's an effort that's associated with it. And so, if we can reduce that effort, then that'll just make it that much easier for them to adopt.
So, one question I had, a little follow-on to this one, is when it comes down to justifying the return on your product investments, how do you line? How do you first understand that? How does that influence kind of what it is that you build or not build, even though you may have heard customer pain related to it? Can you share a little bit about kind of that mental model?
Yeah, sure. So, the greatest value we get out of things is to enable an expansion to happen. And so, what are those things that are blockers to expansion is where I would start. I guess it kind of depends on where you think the problem is in the product as well. But for us, I think it's primarily blockers to expansion because, like rolling out to a new business unit should not mean that you are then, doubling the number of administrators you have, or that administrator spending twice the amount of time because you rolled out to, another 100 users, and it's a second business unit. There should be just a tremendous amount of incremental benefit, and so we need to figure out how to enable that situation to scale, and because otherwise the customer would not go for any sort of expansion move, right? Now, if your issue is oriented around the fact that even within a particular business unit, your users are not adopting to the level that's needed, and like if you don't get your users to adopt to the level that's needed in that business unit, then you have not earned the rights to ask for an expansion. So if that's the case, then you need to focus on the user adoption arena.
Great. That's perfect.
It makes me think that no metric in itself in isolation is good enough. So if you just look at adoption, but the effort it takes to get to that level of adoption is too high, then it doesn't matter if you've got great adoption because the value wasn't there, the effort was too high. Right. Another analogy that I like to think about is the CS equation, where success equals the combination of delivering those outcomes and those experiences. And so another way to think about that is sentiment is often a metric that's used to measure the customer experience. So NPS promoter scores, for instance. What does a 9 out of 10 score mean when that executive who provided that promoter score, when that executive's team hasn't logged into the tool in the past 2 months?
Right.
It's you need the combination of those different scores to blend into a meaningful health score. So when you think about measurement of success, it's a little bit of a nuanced process of thinking through what are the combination of variables that it takes to deliver value, positive experiences, in a way that's scalable and meaningful for the business.
Got it. So you touched on this as well, but moving to the next question really is collaboration between the two teams. So what information is helpful for product to provide success and vice versa, customer success into product? I think we touched on some of these things before, but Minh, I don't know if you want to start this off. I mean, what is it that you find, what is it that you need and the product organization need from the success work?
Yeah, well, in addition to like the help with prioritization and the customer stories, I think it's really important to think about the data that you're getting. So, we use in-product tooling to get information about customer, usage, how people are using the product. But you really need to combine what you're seeing in the data with the qualitative. And so in addition to collecting the usage data, we would then validate and expand our understanding directly with customers as well as with our CS teams. And so it's just really important to have those regular engagements, and we set those up every quarter. Multiple meetings, both with external customers on specific topics, as well as internally with an executive team that cuts across all functions, by the way. So support as well, for example, right? And professional services. And then we actually have also a separate meeting just with the CS team. And sometimes, like we drill into one specific feature area and get really, really great feedback.
Interesting. So you're looking at a set of product usage and you identify some trends within that. Says these customers are perhaps the usage of a given product area is declining over time. Here are the accounts that I'd like to better understand that problem. So your first ask of the success org is really, what are you hearing from these customers, and does this number line up with what they're talking about, what they're telling you?
Totally. Help us connect with these customers, get them in the same room. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Ganesh, how about you? I mean, what is it that you need more of from product, or the success org collectively should be getting from product?
Yeah, from a data perspective, I think, a lot of clients come and ask, how do I get that usage data so I can act upon those insights?
Mm-hmm.
And so we talked about this earlier, so we don't need to go back into it, but having a hypothesis-driven approach to asking product for that adoption data, that usage data, is super critical, so that you have an understanding of what actions you would actually take
Mm-hmm.
based on the data you're given. From the broader perspective, outside of just the data, there's a lot of, especially when you think about strategic accounts that you are developing a long-term partnership with, where the customer didn't just buy your product and services for what you offer today, but for the roadmap of where you will be one day, is having that engagement, having, it's not necessarily data, but collaboration efforts from product to inform not only your knowledge as a customer success manager in your engagement, but then on occasion to come in for a strategic account and spend some time and start talking about where the partnership can go in the future in terms of product enhancements.
Yeah.
Those are two kind of different ways I think about it.
Yeah.
In the world of like sort of big data, where you presume that everything can be tracked, and understanding like how your customer behavior can be tracked via data, especially like, with tooling like Google Analytics, for example, that's really designed for web page views more in marketing more than anything else, right? And I think like a lot of product managers might be misinformed by using some of that data, and so in this world, like you need to really validate what you are presuming you're getting out of the data with real customer conversations, and so that's why the customer success team is so important as a part of this this conversation.
That's great. I mean, just to try to summarize on this question, it sounds as though, I mean, product teams, when they have the right level of analytics and usage data, that what they need from the success org is some level of validation, or are there things that are happening outside of product usage that may influence why I see this behavior?
Yeah.
And then on the opposite side, if the success org has a book of business and a set of accounts, they'll want to understand, what are the things that should be increasing adoption? What are the trends that the product team is seeing across the entire, customer base? And how does that apply to the features that are being used by this particular customer or collection of customers? So I think it's, when done well, it's a great union of really sharing and collaboration.
Yeah.
So we have one final question before we open up to the audience here. So, related to best practices, there's a lot of information coming from both sides, collecting, decisioning, and how do you act upon that information. I mean, it's, I can imagine being very overwhelming at times, just the different sources, perhaps, strategic accounts coming with information. I mean, how does this all get reconciled? And what are some best practices that you guys have seen in practice that work well for the organization?
Yeah, I can start out here just thinking about some research that we've done in the voice of the customer space, also a space where Gainsight offers some capabilities. But the first piece of advice that I found is you don't want to collect feedback, especially if it takes effort for the customer to provide it, if you're not going to take action on it.
Right.
It's almost like when you influence the experiment by observing. It's like if you're constantly surveying somebody, eventually they're going to get fed up and they're not even going to respond.
Right.
And guess what? The experience is pretty bad. Maybe because you should have stopped asking how the experience was. So that's kind of the first piece of best practice is always think about the action you're going to take as you're designing your feedback processes. The second thing is when you put in that right cadence, and say you're getting direct customer feedback in the form of digital surveys, maybe in-person interviews or various forums, think about how you blend what the customers are saying with what they're doing. And so this is where the usage data becomes so important. Being able to blend a customer that provides a certain amount of feedback and says, this is my feeling about how it's going, and you can map that to some objective understanding of what they did to get to that result. Now you've got some real two sides of the story of don't just judge me on what I say, but what I do, and now you can actually take an action that's a lot more impactful. So those are two things that I think about is one, making sure you're only collecting it when you're going to take action on it, and then two, if you can get it from some other source other than direct customer feedback, It'll likely be more objective, and you're probably going to be able to take a more insightful action out of it.
Okay.
Yeah. For me, it's also being timely and in the right context as well. So sometimes you've collected feedback over time, and you might have something that's been in your backlog for a long time, and maybe it has a lot of votes, but we have to ask the question, this request was made 2 years ago. Is it still relevant in the product's current state today, right? Like people's roles and responsibilities and the job of customer success has changed over the course of 2 years. Is this just as important as it is back then, right? Or maybe you've developed a new capability that really just makes this request less relevant. And so I think thinking about is this still timely for what is needed and important today? And then the timely and relevance also applies to data collection as well. So collecting the information in the moment that you're seeing the problem is helpful. So if it's in a moment that's in the product, then having methods in the product to survey or collecting the data is super, super helpful. If it's a problem that has to do with outside the product associated, then you collect it in the moment then. And so just trying to be timely and in the moment are the things that I look for.
Excellent. No, it's very well described. Kind of the relevancy of the feedback, the frequency of when you solicit, who you're soliciting it from, and again, making sure that when you're using it, it's being communicated back to your customers, be more willing to give it in the future.
Yeah. The one thing maybe I'll add to that is and folks can maybe do some research on this offline, is the inner loop and outer loop process for acting on feedback. It's a framework developed by Bain & Company. Fred Reichfeld, I think, is the inventor of NPS, and put in a framework for what do you actually do with that data. And there's two processes associated with feedback. There's the inner loop, which I think Minh actually really eloquently described. The perfect inner loop feedback would be you find something in the product, you immediately in the product respond to that almost in real time, and you're taking action on it. Let's call it the outer inner loop would be a CSM does some hand-to-hand combat, gets the feedback in their inbox, and immediately starts acting with the client to improve that. The outer loop is now over the course of all of your research, you found out some trends across the business. What cross-functional processes can we put in place to improve the entire customer experience across all the customers? So maybe one way to think about getting both the real-time and the programmatic improvements.
Very nice. Well, let's hand the microphone over to the audience now. So for everyone on the line, if you have questions for Minh or Ganesh, please feel free to ask it. There's a Q&A portion that you can ask. We've got a couple questions already. The first question here, how can you successfully communicate with customers how you are choosing to prioritize new feature/enhancement requests? I think this might be directed at you.
Yeah, I think that's it's really important to have that sort of a feedback loop. So part of the communication is helping the customer understand what else overall you're doing, so that the customer can understand where you're taking the product. And some of the feedback may be associated with everything else that you're doing. And so I think communicating the broader direction and value and everything else that you're doing is super important. And then on the specific feedback, being able to systematically communicate when feedback has reached a certain stage. So when it's reached a stage where it is now, a part of the design work, and being able to communicate and tag customers who have requested this, so that they can participate potentially in the product design, in the beta, and then in the early adoption of the product. So absolutely tracking who's requesting it, doing that feedback loop is super important.
Great. The next question we have here, how much of engagement, usage, and adoption is on the product and customer success team versus the leadership team of the customer themselves?
Yeah, I can jump in from a CS perspective. The way I describe the awesome CSM at Gainsight is the one who takes ownership over coaching the customer to get the most out of their relationship with Gainsight. So that's enabling the leadership team of the customer to be champions of Gainsight, enabling them to motivate their team, to train their team, to use both the carrot and the stick to get them on this new process. Change management is not something that happens overnight, and it's not something that can happen from a vendor or a consultant. It has to be from the inside out and from the top down. Mm-hmm. So if the CSM is doing their job, they're enabling that leadership team to buy into the program, and they're coaching them on how to do it as best as possible.
Very nice. The next question we had here is related to the DEAR model. So the question here is, how can you measure engagement within the DEAR model?
Yeah, it's a great question. And just to recap, the D stands for deployment, the A stands for adoption of those deployed licenses, the R stands for ROI, and the E, to kind of circle back to the question, is engagement. So we think about engagement as, are the customer key personas engaging with you on a regular basis? So a couple metrics that we use: are they attending the weekly meetings? Are they submitting responses to the survey? Sometimes a non-response to a survey is as telling as a promoter or detractor score itself. Other methods of engagement. So are they coming to your events? Are they digesting your thought leadership? Are they attending webinars? Are they engaged with you digitally on your blog posts? Are they opening your emails? There's a lot of different ways you can go down this track of thinking. But the higher level point is, sometimes your customers might be adopting your product, your licenses may be deployed, and you believe you might even have tangible ROI. But if they've gone silent for a period of, let's say, 2 to 3 months, and they're a strategic account, maybe they've already been talking to a competitor. Maybe they're starting to think about a transition process behind the scenes. And so you really want that engagement to be high as well.
Very nice.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think getting the right personas in the engagement is important as well. So we've mentioned end users, we've mentioned, like adoption champions or the executive sponsor for the project.
Right.
But like IT, for example, is often a forgotten part of the engagement. Like for our product, it's a very data-intensive, integration-oriented kind of product, and so to not have the support of IT, for example, then also means that the other folks are trying to work around IT, and creating additional complexity that might be not supportable in the long run. And so, making sure you've got the right stakeholders involved, including IT, can be quite critical.
Okay. We have a question here, is if we can share a visual example of the DEAR framework. I'll be happy to send you something afterwards.
That sounds good.
Let's see. We have one more question here. So let's wrap up with this one. It says, where is the line between developing a minimum viable solution for a customer and seeing through a feature to include all necessary components that will be needed / used down the line?
Yeah. I think the hard part is always that you can build.
Yeah.
Like completely down a certain list, right? But it's hard to also tell how customers or users will react to what you've developed. And so we do have to think through kind of what is the MVP, partly because we want to build to a certain extent that the customer will get initial value out of it, and then have them deploy it, have them get the value. But then once they've gotten the value, they can actually provide much greater clarity and feedback on what is needed next. Otherwise, if you build too far out, then I'm sure you will get it wrong, right? So it's important to build in essentially an iterative approach to what you've developed, so that you are getting truly the right feedback based on real usage of the product.
Yeah, I would imagine, there's potential for diminishing returns. Let's say you have a single feature that can be, bedazzled, so to speak, to do just about anything you want.
Yeah.
But you could over-invest potentially relative to the value the customer sees. I think that's a tricky balance with the MVP concept.
Yeah, and actually potentially creating negative value as well, because then you're creating complexity
Yeah.
Maybe it's another option that only like 1% of the people use, but then it's like, oh, it's the 99% has to think about that option.
Right. That's great. Well, great. Well, everyone, we're wrapping up on time here. I'd like to, thank our speakers here. Ganesh, Minh, thank you so much for providing your insights into such an interesting topic. I would like to offer to all attendees of the webinar, for a free trial of Aptrinsic, we offer a level of information that provides value to both success and product teams to help them align their work for growth. So thank you again to our speakers, and thank you all for attending. Goodbye.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Travis.